Igor Mikhailovich, people often ask the following questions and get confused with the answers. For example, what is I? Or, if my I is not connected with the body, then how can I hear? Or how can I hear myself? Or how can this I observe the state of its own consciousness? Or another question, how to distinguish in oneself where I am as a personality and where my consciousness is? In general, how does consciousness work? What is the life of personality as a spirit? Well, and many other questions. It's just that people lack an understanding of these questions.
Yes, people lack an understanding, and this is caused by the intensive development of psychology, philosophy, various religious movements, and trends that have strengthened the position of our consciousness, and personality of a modern human is in a less favorable position compared, for example, to a human who lived even 1,000 years ago. Why? Because the information flow is too strong. There are too many offers that lead in various directions, and personality simply gets confused while consciousness is active. The system is active. It has always been active, but now it is also well armed. It is armed with its scriptures that it created. It is armed with modern technologies, not only books as before, but with the internet, television and everything else, so personality is in such a less favorable position than consciousness. That is why, in fact, this time is called the time of the crossroads, or the time of human choice, which road to take.
Yes, the human choice between the inevitably dead and the eternally alive.
Absolutely right. I guess in order to get a bit of a better understanding, we will have to look beyond the quantum limit, which puts in order what seems to consciousness to be chaos, and look at the usual material objects that exist up to the sixth dimension, and at the same time to look beyond the limits of the sixth dimension, where there is something that people call the soul. Perhaps, indeed, we should talk about this a little bit. So let's look beyond the quantum limit and consider, from a simple perspective of an ordinary person, so that there is an understanding of what consciousness is, how it works, and what personality is. We will begin with elementary points. Logicians may argue or not, but I will tell it the way it is, without complicating these processes. And whoever disagrees with this, but wants to find confirmation, can look for answers in other sources, and the one who craves will always find. Let's begin with simple points. What is human consciousness? How is it arranged? And most importantly, why do many closed, religious, I emphasize, organizations dream of the ninth day? What does the ninth day mean in general? And where does this concept originate from? This story is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and up till now, there exists a priestly clan that is doing a lot to implement the ninth day. This is interesting. This is akin to worldwide conspiracies. It's for those who like the topic of conspiracies. This is funny, of course, but it is true. So for a better understanding, perhaps we will start with how a human evolves, how it all happens.
Yes, it would be of significant help for people to understand what consciousness really is and what you are as personality.
Yes, of course. There are two types of consciousness. The first consciousness, let's call it primary consciousness, is the main one and is born together with the physical body. It's a consciousness of a primate, of an animal. While the next layer of consciousness, which manifests itself in opposition to the manifestation of personality in a human body, is already secondary consciousness. Secondary consciousness is like a modern consciousness or a new consciousness. It is also called human consciousness. Here it's important to understand that owing to secondary consciousness, we have overtaken apes in our intellectual development.
Now, this is a very important point. This is exactly the answer which neurophysiologists have already been looking for many, many years. But they're still stuck in the same place. Well, at least they have been stuck until this historical moment.
Yes, that's right. So this new consciousness is very aggressive and active. Although both one and the other part of our consciousness are nothing else but a part of the whole system. And it is clear that it's a field structure. By no means these are neurons of the brain and the like. Neurons of the brain, we already discussed this in one of the videos, are merely, let's say, physics. Neurons are the structures which transform information that comes from the field structures of consciousness into physical, then into chemical reactions, then back into physical ones, and so on. But this is by no means where a thought merges or originates from and where it works. As of today, thank God, our scientists already understand perfectly well that they observe only reactions. Although they are trying to catch a thought, to grasp something, but they see and observe a reaction.
Meaning they see the consequence, not the cause.
Yes. So I'll go back a little. At the very beginning of a human being, while he is still in the mother's womb, along with the development of his brain, the so-called primary consciousness develops. Why is it exactly primary? Because it develops in utero. After the birth of a human being, primary consciousness is directly connected with the entire composition of the human body. It controls the entire human chemistry and everything else. But it has, I would say, an ill-defined intellect, meaning this consciousness is limited, but it is also connected with secondary consciousness. And here's an interesting point. A human soul enters a person exactly on the 8th day. Before the 8th day, a human is no different from an animal. A chimpanzee also has quite a well-developed primary consciousness. The analogy is actually very close. Let's say children of an ape and a human up to 3 years of age, up to 5 years old, develop practically in the same way. But then a human begins to break away sharply. Why does this happen? Precisely because on the 8th day after birth, a human, like a vessel, is filled with a human soul, and the soul creates personality. Personality is exactly what a human is in reality. It is who you are.
Soul and personality are exactly the spiritual components, and why a human became a human, and why he was created in God's image and likeness. It is because there was a part of the spiritual world in him.
Here again, it's an interesting point. I don't want to miss it. Many people associate the soul with something intelligent and all-knowing. But the soul is the door, let's say, to the Academy of Sciences. There are smart people in the Academy of Sciences who know everything. But tell me, does the door know anything? Smart people walk through the door. However, by itself, it is a door. The soul is a portal. It's an open door to the world of God. While personality is that very student or junior research assistant who has come to work in this academy and can learn everything. But the soul is nothing other than a passage to knowledge. It is clear that all these are just words. It is clear that all these are just allegories. But it's an attempt at the current level to explain what it is.
Igor Mikhailovich, as for this practice of who am I, it is mentioned in the book AllatRa, and you talked about it in the previous videos. It specifically implies that it is necessary to get deeper to an understanding that I is actually you as personality, right?
Yes. In understanding I, it is personality. And personality is what is directly connected with primary consciousness. The very practice of who am I exactly implies that a person must find what I is, meaning personality.
Meaning I as personality that is connected both with the soul and with primary consciousness, exactly the consciousness of a primate you have previously talked about, that the development of a monkey and the development of a child are identical up to a certain point.
Absolutely right, meaning with the consciousness of a primate, in its development it remains at the level of a child, that is, at the level of 5 to 6 years of age at best, but more often even younger.
This primary consciousness, the consciousness of a primate, actually connects personality with three-dimensionality, right?
Yes. Primary consciousness as such is directly connected with the three-dimensional world. It is connected with sight, hearing, and all our tactile sensations. It is associated with everything that enables us to perceive the three-dimensional world. Primary consciousness is what gives information about the three-dimensional world to our personality.
This is a very important point for understanding, because since childhood, the system has been telling us that it is the information received from the senses that shapes a person's perception of the world and oneself. But in reality, personality has a completely different perception, different from the perception of matter as such. It is different from the perception of that very body in three-dimensionality that is controlled through the brain by primary consciousness. This is a global setup from the system, substitution of the concept of who you really are. In other words, what have we been taught since childhood? That it is exactly you who perceives this world by means of 5 basic senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. That it is exactly you who feels pain, the difference in temperature, pressure, the sense of balance, the position in three-dimensional space, acceleration in it, the sense of weight, some other kinesthetic sensations. In other words, scientifically speaking, all this is nociception, theroception, equilibrioception, and proprioception of the body. So, in fact, these are the problems of the body reflected in primary consciousness, while the system puts an equal sign between you and the body. Although all this bodily perception of three-dimensionality is merely a product of primary consciousness, nothing more. All this information about three-dimensionality, all the events, all the situations and experiences, all of this is a derivative of consciousness. This is not you. Where is the substitution? In the fact that it is not consciousness that perceives, but allegedly you are the one who perceives. The system has again substituted the clues to notions. It's like in the tradition of Zoroastrianism, what we've already mentioned, when at the beginning a human knew that Ormazd created water, earth, plants, animals, and so on. But then consciousness told him that Ahriman created water, plants, animals, and so on, meaning lies and substitutions are the way the system works, while primary and secondary consciousness are parts of the system. And this applies to everything: a person's life, the meaning of his existence, and the question of who he really is.
Yes, personality and consciousness. A human is dual, and consciousness as a part of artificial intelligence, as part of the system, does everything for only one side to develop, for consciousness to dominate. Even in religions, what do we observe? Prayers, mantras that are uttered aloud or are mentally repeated many times. What do they develop? Primary or secondary consciousness? But what about the spirit?
Yes.
Hence, people, without understanding it, do absolutely everything for consciousness to dominate, meaning the human essence, while the angelic essence, which is who they really are, is simply enslaved. People perceive themselves as consciousness, with lots of thoughts in the head, with emotional outbursts, while the spiritual is lost. The spirit, unfortunately, does not develop. It turns out that you live like an intelligent animal. That is where greed, hatred, envy, and death come from.
Yes, while everything true, pure, and divine doesn't develop, although it should be developed in the first place. But you just renounce what makes you dead. Shift the power of your attention and live inside by that which makes you alive. Until I understood this in practice, it was very hard to live by consciousness, because consciousness is a pile of doubts, all kinds of its alternatives and algorithms. Whereas the life of a developing personality is something completely different. Personality perceives any situation holistically, in a voluminous way. Personality knows and doesn't doubt. And the difference between perceptions is huge. Personality perceives cause and effect relationships holistically and in a voluminous way, even that which is presented by consciousness. This is a completely different life. It is very different from biological life. It is consciousness that creates a cause and reaps the consequence. Consciousness always has fragmentation, division, and plenty of chaos, but it's just a stream of processed information, which is presented to personality as an already prepared form. In order to understand yourself as a spirit, the best way is to develop it in yourself and not wait for everything to happen on its own. Nothing will happen if you do not make an effort.
Absolutely right. I would also like to say that consciousness puzzles a person so much, both with relationships and with attaching his attention to daily routine, that it just doesn't let him come to his senses. And what does it hide from personality? The fact that a human is actually a spirit. It hides the fact that for consciousness, personality is just a source of nutrition, and that all this fuss is simply useless if, in the end, death awaits you.
Absolutely right. So, in this practice, who am I? We consciously develop that, which is something to whom primary consciousness tells everything, meaning what we see, hear, touch, in general, all our perception of three-dimensionality, whereas secondary consciousness is exactly that which continues to develop. If primary consciousness gets stuck in its development, meaning stops its development at the level of about 5 to 6 years of age, more often even younger, meaning consciousness remains similar to that of a primate, then secondary consciousness continues its further development. And exactly by means of secondary consciousness, we analyze, think.
Yes, we actually analyze with secondary consciousness. It's a paradox, and we think that it is what we are.
Well, it seems to us that we analyze and think. Again, let's go back. We are personality. Personality has nothing to do with the three-dimensional world. Well, let's say it is much higher in its dimensional hierarchy. Personality is directly connected with primary consciousness, but it is not connected with secondary consciousness. Secondary consciousness is what we habitually consider to be ourselves. That is how thoughts and images come. Our computing processes go on, that very logic and many other things. So all these pictures, all this information that comes to us, it goes through secondary consciousness into primary consciousness, and then it is already primary consciousness that presents it to personality. That is for understanding of what follows what and why.
Yes, and the key substitution is in self-identification. It is us who think.
Here, the paradox is precisely in the fact that we perceive all this as it is us who think, and so on. However, we are personalities. Personality doesn't think. It doesn't have an ability of thinking process in the direct understanding, the way we regard it. It is primary consciousness that is able to think and reason. But again, without secondary consciousness, all thoughts are reduced to almost a primitive state or to the consciousness of a primate. There will be very few thoughts, and only about what is necessary, mainly with the domination of our desires.
And a lot of emotions of a primate.
Yes, and it is again caused by the emotional sphere. Hatred, enmity, envy, all this is in primary consciousness. Well, and craving, desires, urges, and everything else. While secondary consciousness is exactly what imposes a lot of different desires and interests on primary consciousness. It is what we perceive as ourselves. Most often, a person associates himself precisely with secondary consciousness, even omitting primary consciousness at the early stages when he embarks on the spiritual path and really begins to study and observe. He observes the actions of secondary consciousness with the help of primary consciousness. Only afterwards, he can find the one who observes primary consciousness and can start developing already as personality. And the more he develops as a personality, the more he gets used to another way of not thinking, but perception. This is perception through feelings. It is, let's say, akin to understanding the whole process without reasoning and imposing all sorts of unnecessary thoughts as maybe or somewhere out there. Well, it is, let's say, something different. It is hard to express it. That's the paradox. In reality, it is hard to express how personality perceives the world. Well, it doesn't perceive the world at all. It exists and let it be.
Well, Igor Mikhailovich, people might have the following question from consciousness. How is it not thinking? What about the fact that we discourse about the spiritual? Thanks to the fact that we discourse in our thoughts or talk with someone out loud, we come to the spiritual.
A person never comes to the spiritual by discoursing about the spiritual. When a person discourses about the spiritual, he just discourses about the spiritual. He's like the awaiter, homunculus loxodontus, sitting and discoursing. He is sitting and waiting for it to come, while personality has the ability to move. That is, thanks to this inner impulse, the inner striving of personality, a human is able to come to the spiritual world. Precisely thanks to that genuine thirst and that aspiration for personality, there is no space and there is no time. This is something different.
Here perhaps we need one more clarification, because the next question will be, what does it mean to move on the spiritual path? Because for an ordinary person in three-dimensionality, the notion of moving means that I have to move in space.
Absolutely right. Here again we are facing a paradox. In the understanding of consciousness, the very movement towards the spiritual means that it is necessary to cover a distance or some space or time, meaning something must be overcome. Yet what does personality overcome on the way to the spiritual world? Obstacles from consciousness. Merely that. In other words, having moved away from dependence on consciousness, having escaped from under its power or having broken free from its slavery, personality becomes free and then it can strive, let's say, to merge into one light. Here, of course, we can find many epithets and associative examples, but all of them will be associated with the three-dimensional world, familiar to consciousness, and none of them will be accurate, because it is something completely different. It's not even a different physics. It is something far beyond physics, meaning to become a single whole with the spiritual world, or become a part of it. What is important, even having become a part of the spiritual world, personality retains its individuality and becomes truly free. Here it is also difficult for consciousness to understand. What is freedom? What does it mean to become boundless while preserving one's own individuality? Well, again, we speak the associative language, and we use examples that are really difficult to convey. To put it simply, it's better to do it than to hear about it. It's better to reach there and see. Just start living, then everything falls into place and becomes clear. This is easy, beautiful, and interesting.
It is also interesting that a word actually has power, and knowing about this sacrament, human consciousness simply manipulates the meaning of words. Even in science, the fact has been known already for a long time that our brain, or it would be more accurate to say our consciousness, confuses the process of conveying information about reality by means of language with the reality itself. Basically, this is one of the algorithms of such a subtle substitution and distortion from consciousness. Consciousness just works this way. So, as a person's speech develops, or as we understand now, as the functions of secondary consciousness develop, consciousness already begins to code experience in words. That is why, in the majority of cases, we don't even notice when words already become more real for us than the reality itself. But words are merely associations and symbols. It's an attempt to convey in three-dimensionality the experience gained through feelings. Igor Mikhailovich says absolutely right that one should simply live by the spiritual reality inside oneself. There is a wonderful parable in the East on how a disciple asked his master about the purpose of words, and the master told him that words are a finger pointing at the moon. But when you have seen the moon, you need to forget about the finger.
Yes, when you go through all of this in practice, you already see this difference, which you simply haven't noticed before. The difference in substitutions of the most crucial understandings. For example, when in practice, through the deepest feelings, you feel the reality of the spiritual world, you understand that you actually experience this boundless happiness. You feel it. You understand that there are no wishes, because there is everything there. And there is the joy of boundless love and a lot of opportunities. But this is exactly a holistic, voluminous understanding, which differs drastically from the understanding by consciousness. Roughly speaking, what does consciousness mean by the understanding of having everything, having many opportunities? For consciousness, it is to have a roof over one's head, a house, an apartment, family comfort, a car, and maybe a penny for food and clothes. Well, endless desires to have everything, meaning everything material, everything which is in three-dimensionality, everything which is mortal dust. And now you understand that the need to have everything, to have many opportunities, and to live in the joy of infinite love actually comes from personality, from its desire to start living, from its desire to truly start living. But consciousness substitutes the understanding of it all and simply diverts your attention to what is mortal. For instance, previously you heard that the spiritual world is some sort of light, and you imagined it all from your consciousness as you could, based on all the movies, other people's images and stories that your earthly ears heard and your earthly eyes saw. After all, what is light in your consciousness imagination? It is like bright sunlight which breaks through the darkness of clouds, or simply sunlight which comes to replace the dark of night. But now you understand, you feel, you know that there, in the spiritual world, it is totally different. There is light there in which shadows are not created. There is light there and no darkness. And it's not what your consciousness imagines, as light which blinds or shines in the eyes. No, it is completely different. Or, as before, you read in a book and told others about it that the spiritual world is boundless joy filled with life, and that it is peace. But you yourself didn't understand how happy joy and peace can be combined simultaneously, because according to the understanding of your consciousness, joy is an emotion, while peace is rest in dreams, or sleep, or simply when your body is sitting on a chair and doing nothing. Meaning, these are merely like two different states of consciousness. And you realized only in practice what was meant by this concept. Because there, in the spiritual world, there is indeed a living joy. There is a living vigor there. There is a full, constantly new and unique life in boundlessness. And at the same time, there is stability and peace. And this is completely different from what your consciousness imagines in three-dimensionality.
Igor Mikhailovich, one of the important points in our conversation is an understanding of what a human is as personality. Because now a lot of people don't even suspect that when thinking or talking about oneself, in reality, in the majority of cases, a person simply voices problems and lies of his secondary consciousness and impressions from the movie which primary consciousness is playing for him. Could you please specify in more detail what primary and secondary consciousnesses are and how they interact, and especially what secondary consciousness is?
Secondary consciousness is like an antipode of personality. It is nothing other than the same reflection. We already talked about this. When a soul enters on the 8th day, a human becomes a human, a personality appears in him. And as an antipode of personality, secondary consciousness emerges. It is indeed a very strong artificial intelligence. Why artificial? We already discussed it, because the whole system is created artificially, and both primary and secondary consciousnesses are nothing other than a part of the system. Secondary consciousness is more closely, almost directly connected with what people call the Absolute or the higher mind, or, as we say for convenience, the system. It may be called in different ways. In religion it is called the devil. While consciousness, its patterns, in the past were called genies, demons, and such like. There was such an expression, a demon got into someone. Well, why would he get in if he has already been living there for a long time? It is precisely secondary consciousness that criticizes and exposes to everything else. It is what we call intellect. It is what we actively develop when studying in kindergarten, at school, in universities. It is exactly the development of secondary consciousness, and the more actively it is developed, the more tools it has. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be developed. On the contrary, it should be developed as much as possible, but you need to understand what it is. Primary consciousness is connected with both the body and personality, while secondary consciousness is connected only with primary consciousness. And here an interesting point arises, that each of these consciousnesses considers itself as I. And between these consciousnesses, as paradoxical as it might be, there is a struggle. But there is also opposition of both consciousnesses, each one separately and both of them together, against personality. They fight for the power of attention, for those life-giving juices, let's put it in such a material language, which emanate from personality. For that energy, it is like in an example, in order for a light bulb to be on, there needs to be electricity. If we turn electricity off, the light bulb will go out. As long as our personality pays attention to what consciousness has offered us, consciousness is active. When we are busy with some work, thinking and focusing on something, occupied or just actively involved in a conversation, or playing chess or contemplating, it is exactly our secondary consciousness working. It is where a lot of information has to be processed and so on. And we always consider that it is exactly us. But if we think about it and start tracing how thoughts come, while thoughts in fact come mainly into secondary consciousness, all these flashing images, it is all going on there. But they are projected onto primary consciousness, that is, inside of us, let's say in our structure. Primary consciousness observes them. Personality does not observe them directly, but it is through primary consciousness that personality already observes them. And it is exactly personality which gives that power, or that attention, let's call this power attention. It directs this attention to cling to this thought or not, to activate it or not. But what is the paradox also in? Primary consciousness also considers itself as I. It is that little child who lives within every person. Even in an old academician, there lives a little kid. Psychologists and neurophysiologists know this well. I'm not even talking about political scientists. Look, all the systems are developed for a child, for a little 6-year-old kid. That's when they work. Why? Because all this is targeted at primary consciousness.
Yes, at the consciousness, which has told at a child's level. And just now, Igor Mikhailovich, you have given an answer to one more question unsolvable to psychologists until this moment. They look at the duality of a human from their material point of view. And what do they observe? What do they rack their brains over? That a human has several selves, and that there is a child even in the oldest and the smartest person.
Yes, I've recalled how you, Igor Mikhailovich, told us that in the past, people who were developing spiritually became wiser, calmer, and more reasonable by old age, because they already had a lot of experience in spiritual practice, the practice of taming their consciousness. So they already firmly held their consciousness on a leash. They looked at the world already as mature personalities, meaning in the spiritual sense, of course. There was peace and calm, the fullness of life by the spiritual world in themselves. Thus, they lived by the richness and diversity of spiritual life. And in worldly life, in three-dimensionality, their external actions were a reflection of their inner state. Next generations addressed them for this deepest wisdom. These wise people cared for the same peace and calm that was in them to also reign in society, and for people not to have this desperate need for something material. So equally with other people, they participated in the creation of conditions for prevention, for protection of society from the active influence of the system itself. They cared that not a single hair fell from the head of your child, that not a single child went hungry. And this is, of course, incomparable to what is happening in society nowadays, where the keys to spiritual knowledge have been lost. Everything is exactly the other way around.
Yes, alas. And what are the various techniques of manipulation with human consciousness based upon? Right now, unfortunately, this is a very popular topic which is a part of everyday life of an average human. How to influence, how to secretly control, manipulate the consciousness of other people, how to control the crowd. What is all this based upon? Exactly on the influence on this child who lives within every person, meaning on the underdeveloped primary consciousness. If we look globally, what is going on in a person himself, in that very environment of his, in the micro-community? The same as in macro, meaning all religions, all political organizations, and all priestly organizations are based on this manipulation and such an influence. Everything is explained as if to an infant, meaning as if to a child of 5 or 6 years of age.
Of course.
And no one knows why it is exactly this way and not otherwise.
Why? Because in reality, primary consciousness has power over secondary consciousness or the new consciousness. It does have power over it.
And when personality is developing spiritually, how can it become free from all this?
How does personality function? After all, personality, due to certain laws, is in direct contact with primary consciousness. But again, human secondary consciousness dictates to the primate, meaning primary consciousness, and tells it, shows images, and then primary consciousness already presented all to personality. But when a person gains certain degree of freedom by working on himself, he already begins to dictate and tell this consciousness of the primate what to do. In this way, he controls consciousness entirely. So can the devil be defeated? Not just can, but should be. And first of all, he should be defeated in oneself. He cannot be defeated in everyone. In everyone, it's up to every person. And we again come back to where we started. By defeating him in yourself, you have changed your world. And this is very important. But when there are many of such people, then society changes. Well, and then the overall power is lost. I mean the power of Satan. And society becomes free. Well, this is the dream of any society. That's the way it should be. We spoke about this more than once, that consciousness as a part of the system always imposes. It is active, it forces, it compels, it tempts, while the spiritual world is simply there. It's enough for a person to calm down, to move away from thoughts, and he realizes that he can observe his thoughts, and the one who observes is precisely personality. And when he begins as personality from the position of this observer, to put the power of attention into the spiritual world, meaning into perception through feelings of that which is beyond the verge of this three-dimensionality, then he starts seeing even better how thoughts try to control him, how they manipulate him. But when a person indeed studies it fairly well and realizes that consciousness is not him, then naturally it loses power over him. And here a person can choose and act. It doesn't mean that life changes externally, but it becomes full and interesting. Thus, a person gets rid of such notions as depression, psychological problems, or something else. After all, it all belongs to the system. A simple example, how can a person have depression? Depression is one of the forms of such a complete egoistic self-love. I would even say, when the entire world is bad, only I am good, nobody understands me, and I don't need anything. But at the same time, everybody pay attention to me, to the poor, unhappy one. Well, it is only one of the ways of manipulation.
Of the system attracting attention.
Of course, aspiration for power. A simple question, can personality be involved in this? Of course not, because the first thing a person begins to experience is a constant presence of joy. Well, it is joy in our earthly words. After all, we have to associate it with something. But it is infinite, it is boundless. It is what is called happiness, and to gain happiness is exactly to gain life. It's exactly the meaning of human existence here. If a person has lived a life and hasn't started living, he is here in vain. Well, there is an understanding. After all, personality has not gone anywhere. It has comprehension, but it is underdeveloped as it was a child. So it remained a child, and such excessive activation, I would say, hyperdevelopment of consciousness, simply beats a person up and he becomes not even a slave, he becomes a zombie. He does everything that consciousness dictates to him. He's just a tool in the devil's hands, no more.
Yes, the one who is controlled by consciousness is controlled by fear, hatred, and understanding of inevitability, and he lives by patterns.
Of course, the first thing he begins to do is to deny everything that is spiritual, or he manipulates the spiritual to his own advantage.
Yes, sects and religious cults are created, and people say that God wants it that way. But as a matter of fact, the process of enslaving personality is taking place. Even if people strive for God, the system sets up authorities on their path who simply make profit on people. They cover their earthly interests by saying that this is pleasing to God, that God wants it so, or God said so. Meaning, they manipulate this for their selfish, political, or economic goals in three-dimensionality.
How can one use God as a cover, use God's name, or God wants it, so give it? Of course it is wonderful if a person wants to help his religious organization, but why say that God wants it so? If you don't know God, why would God need your money? A simple question. Well, isn't it so?
If his nature is completely different.
Of course, he doesn't have any interest in three-dimensionality, in the material world at all, even more so in three-dimensionality. But some people will be outraged. How, after all, we were born here, meaning we were born here by the will of God. But if you think that you were born here by the will of God, then pray to your mom and dad. That means they are your God. I will explain. If you have come to this world, and have come according to the understanding of your consciousness by the will of God, then know that you have come to this world due to the desires and efforts of your mom and dad.
This is like when they say, in the image and likeness, this distinction, that there are body, consciousness and mind, and there is the breath of life, which you have mentioned.
Absolutely right. And what actually is invisible, part which was brought here by angels according to God's will, meaning soul, personality, and the possibility of life beginning. And really, this is indeed fair, this is the supreme fairness and the highest degree of person's freedom. He can choose whom to serve. He can choose death, service to Satan, and an illusion of importance, or he can become an angel, meaning an immortal being, equal among equals, an integral part of the world of God. After all, this is interesting, and this is fair.
Personality is the spirit which has freedom of choice. For many people who encounter the knowledge for the first time, this will be revealing information that the one who travels in space, moves around, the one who makes some actions, for example, drives a car, eats, thinks, this is not a person, this is not he as personality.
In order to find yourself, it's enough to calm down. We have already talked about this, and to watch your own thoughts, your own actions, in quotation marks, your own. And here again, we will see how thoughts come. We will feel these thoughts, they're coming. And we will feel how, I don't want to think about it, but the thought sneaks in. I don't want to talk about it, but I talk. And the one who doesn't want to is precisely personality. Here from this little hook, you start getting to know yourself. The paradox is that you cannot see personality in the mirror. In the mirror, we see nothing other than a temporarily existing material shell.
Yes, it's good when a person understands and is aware of this. But when spiritual knowledge is lost in society, then the system, already starting from a person's childhood, tries to enslave the new personality through primary consciousness. So it imposes that the reflection in the mirror, this is supposedly you, meaning you are the body, you are consciousness, and thoughts are all yours. You see yourself. Thus, it gives these mindsets of material identification so that personality focuses all of its life's attention not on its spiritual self-development, but on the false self from consciousness in three-dimensionality, where there is power and consumption of the system. Many young parents believe that a child, a baby, supposedly doesn't have an attitude towards this world, meaning he hasn't yet learned to lie, he doesn't know how to express those emotions which take root in the older age as patterns.
But this is only until his consciousness has developed at least a little bit. But as soon as secondary consciousness begins to develop, in a child, the first thing we observe is an egoistic manifestation and manipulative moods. That is, the child begins to live the earthly life. The first thing he does is he adapts. He begins to manipulate. He doesn't know how to talk yet. But he knows that if he cries, things will be as he wants. Isn't it so? When he's bored, he begins to act up and he gets picked up, meaning someone pays attention to him. And that's where it all begins.
Yes, basically even a baby already has mechanisms for hidden control of adults. It is child's crying that resounds at such frequencies that it causes discomfort for listeners and impels adults to act and satisfy the child's needs. For the most part, the needs of his primary consciousness, of his body in three-dimensionality. Later on, when a child is growing up, what kind of states can be observed in him? It's a wonder something in three-dimensionality, very emotional, cheerful, or vice versa, a very depressed, oppressed state. While a parent is mostly in an arrogant, super-righteous, anxious or irritable state. And what voice tones? They are accusatory, patronizing, critical, or repressing. In other words, there actually goes training of primary consciousness, the dominant consciousness of a child, by secondary consciousness, the dominant consciousness of a parent. But if adults developed spiritually themselves, there would actually be more true, deep, inner feelings and love, even in spite of provocations coming from the developing consciousness of a child. After all, personality would be developing at the same time. Therefore, parents would be a vivid, good spiritual example for their children. Both parents and children would benefit. And you're absolutely right that the system, in fact, from the very childhood, trains a child to attract attention to himself. And this is connected with the development of primary and secondary consciousness. So starting from a person's childhood, the system prepares a slave for itself.
Well, yes, and it teaches a child that the voice in his head, this programs actors from consciousness. This is all him. It is his voice. These are his thoughts. These are his fantasies. I recall the time when you, Igor Mikhailovich, told us that after the primary surge, an intensive development of secondary consciousness begins in children.
Absolutely right.
All this can be traced in children at the age of 3 to 7 years old, when they begin to exhibit vivid imagination, images, pictures, I wants, greed. That is when intensive development of secondary consciousness takes place.
Of course. And then we see children grow up. It's one family. Children are a year in age apart, for example. And one is an egoist, the other one is kind, he's doted on. Who is to blame? This is an interesting question. The child was just born like this. You cannot say that they have different upbringing. They have absolutely the same upbringing. Their parents are wonderful. They are raised since childhood with the highest moral values and ethical norms in the human understanding. But a person grows up, either a drug addict or a scoundrel. This often happens. Why does this happen? This is the influence of the streets or someone else? Well, no. This is all a part of development of consciousness, and everything starts from that moment when secondary consciousness begins to develop.
I would also like to add regarding the fact that when secondary consciousness develops from childhood, the system teaches a child to draw attention to himself. When you first told us about this, it was very easy to read scientific works on studying the psychology of children with this key of knowledge and, in general, to understand more than what is described there, to understand the real cause of one or another behavior of a child. It was even easy for us to answer the questions which scientists ask themselves. For instance, about the paradoxicality of children's conversations. Unlike adults, for a child, a word is close to an action. When, for example, two children are talking, it's like a monologue together. Each of them persistently tries to connect the other to his thought or to his action. But at that, he doesn't strive to be heard. The child is talking as if to himself, as if he is thinking out loud.
Absolutely right.
And he believes that everyone else perceives the world around exactly the way he perceives it. A child of this age is in the process of constant monologue. He is interested neither in a companion's point of view nor in his thoughts. A child doesn't actually care about being heard or understood. The key characteristic of his thinking at this stage is just pronounced egocentrism. A companion for him is just a stimulus. Only this visible interest of a companion is important to the child.
Yes, exactly.
Meaning, to put it simply, to steal attention, a hunt for attention is taking place. It's a common situation when adults talk about something and a child stands up in the middle and starts asking for something or saying something, acting out, thereby drawing the attention of all adults to himself.
The system first teaches how to seize attention, then how to manipulate it. Then it turns it into a constant action, forming it into a certain system. Well, and naturally, as a result of the subsequent development of secondary consciousness, a child can already actively think up all sorts of situations, imagine objects which do not exist in reality, and claim it as reality. But the fact is that for a child, very often, these fantasies of his are the same reality as something that surrounds us is for us. It's only the work of his consciousness.
Yes, and here's also an interesting point about the reaction to criticism. In response to criticism from another consciousness, secondary consciousness already activates defense mechanisms.
Absolutely right.
It actually regards what is happening as a threat.
Already from childhood, the system accustoms a person to I as the center of his egoism, I as pridefulness. That's why it imposes such micro-contests, meaning contests in an argument, and the like.
Meaning such contests in an argument where a small person in all seriousness, by investing the power of attention, is attempting to ascertain who, he or his companion, has a greater ability to impose his thought on the other one. And what does this mean for children? To simply demonstrate one more time who dominates over whom. And such children's behavior is similar to the behavior of monkeys. It's a costly, exhausting process for a person and a super profitable one for the animal mind system. Here is where precious human attention is flowing out to.
Yes, that's right. As a consequence, later on, a grown-up person has these endless contests in his consciousness for the dominance of his ego in the material world.
And naturally, what will a person choose after such a training? He will defend the mythical truth from the illusion of the system and, already in his consciousness, will decry everything spiritual, because he is simply not familiar with it since childhood.
Well, yes.
Such a person is not aware that he is personality.
For him, the notion of personality is completely different. It is what is interpreted by the system. It is his consciousness, it is his egoism, his pridefulness imposed on him since childhood, by his own consciousness. This way the system simply produces slaves for itself. It is clear that secondary consciousness has to be developed for communication and survival in the modern conditions of three-dimensionality, but again, without the dominance in society of the spiritual foundations in daily life. Moreover, in practice and not just in words, a child grows up an egoist, and the system accustoms him to using his consciousness for, let's say, gaining personal benefits and for dominating others, meaning lying even to oneself from the beginning.
Yes, the system accustoms a person to lie even to himself since childhood.
Well, and consequently, what happens in such a case? Later, one needs to make tremendous efforts to retrain oneself and change it all. And it becomes clear why people make the same mistakes. Because primary consciousness doesn't really want to be retrained and to change, while secondary consciousness doesn't change all the more.
You should understand that primary consciousness as well as secondary consciousness are parts of the system, and the system doesn't want to lose power over personality.
That's true. But what is interesting is that sometimes spiritual wisdom comes through in children as well. Despite all the pressure of the system, during the first years of a child's life, primary consciousness is developing more intensively, and it dominates over secondary consciousness. As we already mentioned before, secondary consciousness begins to develop actively after the primary surge. At this age, a child simply possesses spiritual freedom to a greater extent, meaning personality is not so enslaved by patterns. Therefore, sometimes this wisdom comes through. At this age, children are more prone to perception through feelings, to feeling the truth, to the truth which they unfortunately do not receive from adults nowadays.
Yes. There is no practice here either. What do they receive at best from their parents? A theory, an interpretation from secondary consciousness of some elements of one or another religion practiced by their parents, or postulates of their atheistic outlook. And what can secondary consciousness tell a child about God? It says that God is a man with a beard sitting somewhere up there in the clouds, and the child already redirects the search for what he has inside to the search in the external. Later on, all his life, he is seeking where in the external is the way home. From here grows the root of all doubts and, in the end, disappointment from the illusory images of three-dimensionality. For example, let's take Christianity. In religious interpretations of the Bible, in the topic about the work on oneself, the phrase from the Gospel of Matthew is mentioned, saying that, except you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And here, be converted to God is interpreted as a lifestyle change, but again, it is understood at the level of thoughts in three-dimensionality. Yes, it is emphasized there that you should address with all your heart. In some interpretations, it is mentioned that the word heart is an allegory, and in the Bible it mainly means the essence of human personality, concentration of the soul and the spirit. Again, concentration means directing the power of attention. It is said that the main cause of human life is written in our hearts, and it is precisely the heart that makes a spiritual decision about the attitude towards God. It turns out that everything is there, only the keys to understanding are substituted, and without practice a person no longer knows what his soul is in reality, what spirit is, what he is as personality, personality whose real life has nothing to do with illusory three-dimensionality.
But when you are aware of this knowledge, then you also see the grain which was put into these words. That very expression, become as little children, it was exactly meant when personality is more free from the pressure of consciousness and is closer to perception through feelings.
Absolutely right. A child is indeed closer to God. Why? Consciousness develops, but less actively, and personality is freer, not so dependent on consciousness. Therefore, sometimes children say such wise things that are appropriate for an old man who is about to die. Why are old people also more open sometimes? Although not all of them. They can be bad-tempered or aloof. All his life he was a wonderful person, but in old age he becomes too preoccupied because he understands that the meaning of life is not in building a house, giving birth to a child or something else. He has lived out his life. There is already nothing ahead, but he hasn't comprehended the main thing. And what is the main thing? It turns out the main thing is precisely to start living. He was running about all his life and for nothing in vain. Yet we already touched on this in the video, that life rushes by like one day. The same as yesterday, your entire life will pass for you. I'm speaking figuratively for people. It will become yesterday literally today. In this lies the problem, the illusion of time. It seems there is a long time, there are still years ahead. Well, you should live so that every day, every moment, you are ready to leave, but for you, it must be a reward. Yet you cannot accelerate this process. A person doesn't have a right.
Yet everything is simple. If you made a decision to leave, then just start living right now. If you put it off for a moment, consciousness will surely take advantage of this.
There is such a notion, we are touching on it here, as the notion of service to the world of God. And here it begins. What is service to God?
Yes, today many people understand this only from the position of consumers. They live inside themselves by consciousness and not by the spirit. They live by three-dimensionality.
Yes, meaning they are sitting repeating a prayer, and this is what we started our conversation with. They live to the dictation of consciousness, and by means of consciousness they jabber, or read the list of their wishes to the Lord God, inserting praising oaths to Him at that, as if they were addressing their earthly parents as they are used to. I want a car or a doll or something else.
To gain personal benefit.
Absolutely right.
Meaning a consumerist attitude to God.
The worst thing possible.
That is totally not just a distorted concept of service.
And no, the most interesting thing here is that many people say, if you get sick, pray and you will recover. You prayed and yes, you recovered. But what did you ask for? Something material. Thus, based on the commonplace understanding of the division into Satan and God, into two components, you prayed with consciousness to God, and your body recovered. So which God sent you your health after a prayer? Was it the God, eternal? No, it actually turns out that your health, like your body and your consciousness, is in Satan's power. He can take away your health and he can give it. God will not take away your health. And even more so, He will not send you illnesses. What for? But again, consciousness says, you're actually God's child, created in His image and likeness. And He constantly watches only you every day, as if He has nothing else to do, but He is God, He is Almighty, He has many eyes, He watches everyone. And He has a lot of ears, He listens to what you think about and what you talk about. But what you think and talk about is actually known to whom? Again, to the one who is called Satan. And why does he know what you think about? Because these are his programs. This is his world. And he's the one who wrote these programs which are implanted in your consciousness like in a computer.
Yes, everything is dead in the system. There is simply no life. There is only illusion and games of consciousness. Some actors of consciousness play the role of patrons, others of petitioners. But where are people themselves in this? Where is life in them? You look at this entire obscurantism in the world and it is just human foolishness to the dictation of consciousness.
Once, a very long time ago, I came across a handwritten record of a church council where they tried to figure out how many angels are in the heavens. I mean human consciousness. A lot of clever men were busy with trying to count the number of angels in the infinite, boundless world. The limited consciousness of several people tried to count the infinite and boundless number of angels. It's a paradox. But I'm still under the impression from that. What's the point of all this? What kind of megalomania this consciousness has? I mean the system as a whole. And why does a human always consider himself godlike, exactly at the level of consciousness, yet he has only requests towards the spiritual world, but gives nothing in return?
Just the least.
Well, most often fear arises as well, meaning fear of realizing that he exists when personality is active. A person feels this, fear arises, fear of death, and a person already seeks at least to attain peace in order to avoid suffering. He tries to somehow reconcile with religions, with representatives of religions, but again, these are all games of consciousness. Well, what can you do? That's what the world is like.
So, consciousness deceives a person. As a matter of fact, consciousness is just an intermediary between personality and the three-dimensional world, but it can never act as an intermediary between personality and the spiritual world, because the dead knows only about the dead.
Absolutely. This is what makes a human dual. On the one hand, he is tied to three-dimensionality, to the material world, but on the other hand, there is also a spiritual nature in a human which belongs to the spiritual world and helps a person to become the one who, for example, in religion is called an angel, meaning an immortal and spiritual being, but notice also an incorporeal being, and this is important too.
Yes.
After a person's death, let's say, not a single consciousness can enter the spiritual world. Consciousness doesn't perceive the spiritual world at all. And those people who practice seriously and have experience Not faith, I emphasize, but the experience of contact with the spiritual world. They have an understanding, even at the level of consciousness, that something is happening. But even to describe correctly with words, in three-dimensionality, what they feel, just how personality perceives the spiritual world, that's extremely difficult. Again, there comes happiness, all these usual epithets and expressions of something wonderful and boundless. But we cannot describe it in detail. Although at the level of personality, such people understand and know this well. They are happy, joyful, but they cannot describe it.
We were talking about duality, and it's interesting that in many religions, especially in Orthodoxy, such a notion is found as inner and outer person. Regarding the outer person, basically everything is clear. Everyone identifies him with the body. But the inner person, the person who... I know it even from personal experience, that if I hadn't come in contact with the knowledge, if I had not had the experience through feelings and the understanding that personality is spirit, and one can communicate with God only this way, then most likely by the inner person, I would have understood that which is not voiced, simply some thoughts inside in the head.
Absolutely right.
Essentially the work of primary and secondary consciousness.
So again, that primary consciousness would be understood, meaning consciousness of the primate, which controls the new secondary consciousness.
Of course, either pridefulness from primate consciousness or thoughts from secondary consciousness, because mostly it is secondary consciousness that performs whole scenes with its actors. How your search for God should be carried out in three-dimensionality and what your spiritual path should look like as imagined by consciousness. Yet these thoughts are not you, these are lies of the system. And here the most important thing is to understand and figure out who you are in reality.
Right. Secondary consciousness is, indeed, very active, and it is mainly what we consider ourselves to be. Let's say, if we simply calm down and observe how thoughts come to us, just close our eyes, relax, and observe who is giving us these thoughts. At first we hear arguments, we see that something is happening, some images appear, meaning life continues to go on. The question is, who observes these images which appear? It is exactly primary consciousness. At the moment of falling asleep, but when we are not asleep yet, and the activity of consciousness still goes on, at this moment, we can actually observe the activity of secondary consciousness. And thanks to such observation, we can realize that we have two selves, but not the true self. And once we have learned to observe this process, we can also simultaneously learn to feel, meaning to perceive the spiritual world through the deepest feelings. This is perception of the spiritual world through feelings. When a person develops spiritual vision, then, as we have said, a solid table or a solid cup ceases to be solid and have such a shape. The illusion disappears. And we already see all this as some sort of cloths, field structures, banally up to the sixth dimension, while the soul is beyond the sixth dimension. Consequently, everything that is connected with it is also within the threshold, so to say. Personality leaves for the seventh dimension consciously when it merges with the soul. I would say it is on the verge, meaning very, very close to the spiritual world, but when we already identify ourselves, meaning get free from the illusion of matter, from the system itself, from these consciousnesses, we can observe them, we can control them. Here already arises, let's say, not an understanding, but experience, and personality begins to develop, moreover, quickly and actively. What does it mean to develop? Here many will ask the question. Perhaps I will clarify a little bit. In reality, human personality practically doesn't develop in the modern world.
Yes, there are too many distractions from consciousness in the modern world, and people do not even set a goal to get liberated from the power of consciousness and to create better conditions for the spiritual maturation of other generations.
Absolutely right. Tell me, who takes care of the development of their child's personality in the spiritual sense? Those pictures from various religious publications, conversations about God. What is this? This is, again, like bots talk about God.
Yes, young parents simply teach their child what they themselves were taught. And if there is no personal spiritual experience, if they don't multiply spiritual love in themselves, if their perception of the spiritual world through the deepest feelings is not developed, then it is only empty talk and nothing but teachings of theory from consciousness, but without the practice of multiplying love by the spirit in oneself. Of course, they would probably be happy to do it another way, if they only knew how. But they were taught by consciousness to simply believe and hope, but not to live here and now by what is real and innermost.
Again, we return to what? Do I believe or do I not believe? Belief is not knowledge. Belief is a hope that there will possibly be something. Personality can perceive God. Consciousness cannot perceive God. Consciousness can only believe or not believe. Belief only theoretically admits a possibility of His existence. However, personality will always be on the side of God, while consciousness against God. And here it is precisely primary consciousness that plays the determining role. If primary consciousness is controlled by the system or by secondary consciousness, the personality is doomed. If personality controls primary consciousness, it can study the very system from the outside. That's the only way to study the system without damage to health, without damage to your consciousness, let's say.
This is a key point exactly for those who try to study consciousness by means of personal experience or scientifically, because otherwise, to study the system while being in it…
Well, experience shows, we already talked about it, that it doesn't lead to anything good when you study the system while being in the system. We can only observe and receive that information which the system itself will allow us, but not more than that. Yet this will always be beneficial for it, not for us as personality, but for it, as a mortal being, as opposed to us as a potentially possibly immortal being. And here the question is, why potentially possibly immortal? Because that which people call heaven and hell, we'll repeat, we told it many times, but since we've already started, let's put it this way. Personality, when it becomes free from the slavery of consciousness, from matter, and cognizes the spiritual world, then it, getting closer, becomes a single whole with the soul. It becomes that, which is now called an angel. In ancient religions, it was called differently, but the essence doesn't change because of that. A human becomes the one he is supposed to be. An immortal being, and naturally, after the death of the body, being already an angel, he cannot die. He gets liberated as a mature being, figuratively speaking, like a butterfly from a cocoon, and goes over to the spiritual world. It doesn't mean that he flies away somewhere or something else. It is for our consciousness that it's necessary to fly or move somewhere. The spiritual world is endless, boundless, and it is everywhere, simply a little bit higher, so to say. While consciousness simply disappears when personality becomes free. But this is not beneficial for consciousness because it identifies itself as I, and is not beneficial for the very system because consciousness, pardon me for such a primitive comparison, it is like a milking machine for the system, which is connected to a cow, personality, and through it milk, the power of personality's attention. The powers of Allat is extracted as a food product of the system. Consciousness is nothing else but a tool for the existence of the system itself, or the absolute, or as people call it, the higher mind. It is an enhanced way for its nutrition, which gives it life. Thus, the system is interested that personality doesn't become liberated during its lifetime.
Igor Mikhailovich, many people also come up with such a question. They wonder, what is reincarnation? What is the rebirth of the soul?
Now let's touch upon the issue of reincarnation, or the rebirth of the soul. What is the rebirth of the soul? If we talk about it in a simplified way, when personality was not developing, it could not merge with the spiritual world, let's say it is non-viable, then consciousness is preserved. It identifies itself. It continues to work as that same milking machine, but it transitions into a little bit different state, together with that which we call the soul. For physicists, it is more clear. It's like an energy and information structure that passes, figuratively speaking, from one vessel, the destroyed body, into another, the new body. The vessel, the old body, is destroyed. Then a new personality is created when the soul enters a new body, and a new consciousness emerges. But since the soul hasn't left this world, it is being used, the reincarnation takes place. Then naturally the previous personality and those two active consciousnesses, which suppress, also remain. And in this state, a person experiences what is called the torments of hell. He experiences them more at the level of consciousness than personality, at the level of primary consciousness. Notice, it is simply easier for secondary consciousness here, because there is an understanding of this state. While at the level of primary consciousness, there is precisely pain, suffering, and so on, and all the unpleasant sensations. People may ask, how can there be pain if there is no body? I would compare this to the effect when a limb is missing. For example, a person doesn't have a leg, but the toes on the foot are aching. This is called phantom pain. And this is also similar to people who experienced strokes. When they were in the body, but couldn't contact this world, they didn't even have a perception of the body as such, but a clear awareness and understanding of anything and everything remained. This is exactly what the state of subpersonality is, meaning everything that you have accumulated during your lifetime, all that active stuff which you lived by, will accompany you during possibly many reincarnations, until some personality appears which becomes liberated, and then all the structures are destroyed, or speaking the modern language, until there is complete annihilation, meaning everything is erased entirely.
Igor Mikhailovich, touching upon the topic of world conspiracy, you mentioned that there are priestly structures which have been dreaming of the ninth day for far more than 1 century.
What is the ninth day? The system's dream of the ninth day actually asserts that if a soul does not enter a human body as a vessel on the 8th day, the vessel will remain empty, as the soul will no longer be able to enter on the 9th day, and the system will create and cultivate in this defective human that which the system calls God, an immortal, materially manifested being, which will be equal in force to God, meaning it will be able to create other illusions and maintain this illusion endlessly, or an anti-God, so to say.
Many people who are not informed of this issue may have doubts about the fact that there are secret organizations in the modern world which deal with the 9th Day project. But for those who are interested, I can give a hint. Take a look at who initiated and sponsored studies all over the world on in vitro conception of a human, and who advanced science in this direction.
That's a good hint.
Who was interested in this, and why?
Yes. The system always opposes itself to God. It makes people regard the very system as God.
Well, this desire of the system is really seen through its slaves, when some people, being aware of all their worthlessness as a slave, clearly demonstrate to others, strive for, dream and want to be viewed by other people as the ones who are called and regarded as gods. They often tell others that they have attained much in the spiritual world, and they present themselves nearly as an embodiment of God Himself in a body, by and large hubris. By the way, this is precisely what an arrogant person was called in ancient Greece, the one who was full of pridefulness, a hubris.
Unfortunately, these hrubises, or more precisely hubrises, can be met even now.
Yes. All this actually exposes the face of the system which broadcasts through them, an aspiration of the very system to liken itself to God. That is, something petty and worthless is trying to liken itself to the great and boundless. And if we speak using the examples from Christianity, it is like obscurance of simony in their desire to rule over the Holy Spirit.
This very paradox is preserved. Why? Because there is simply a fight for survival of the system itself. After all, it creates such conditions for its own manipulation of itself.
But such a day cannot come, can it?
Well, as to whether the 9th day can come or not, I will repeat once again. Everything here is material. The system exists only within the limits of 6 dimensions. In the 7th dimension, it no longer exists. And about the 6 dimensions, there are 66 more dimensions which will not allow this to happen. For a figurative understanding, at the level of consciousness, I will give an example of what this world is. Just imagine a flower. Any flower, it doesn't matter what kind, for instance, a chamomile. Have you imagined a chamomile? And now imagine that the chamomile has disappeared and a bird has appeared instead of it. Have you imagined? So, for the spiritual world, this world is like that chamomile, which you imagined and immediately forgot. It is momentary and illusory. That's the point. But for people, as personalities, this world is nothing other than either a springboard for a jump into life eternal, or a chasm to long-term torment. The choice is up to people. It is possible to choose here, of course, but in order to choose, it is necessary to know what you choose. And in order to know, you should have experience. And in order to have experience, you should work on yourself. Consciousness says that you shouldn't change anything inside yourself. You should just study and know something about the external in three-dimensionality. Sometimes it says what you need to do, to repeat some meditations, exercises, or something else, whatever you do. Yet without a profound work on yourself, precisely from the position of understanding and knowing all these processes, without searching for the spiritual world inside yourself, nothing will happen. You will not find the spiritual world in the external. It is only possible to find a spiritual world inside oneself, because a path to it lies through a person. We already repeatedly spoke about this in many videos, and before us, many had spoken about it many times. Until a person puts efforts into this, he will never be able to come closer to the spiritual world. And the most difficult and the simplest thing is that, first of all, a person should understand, realize and perceive himself as personality. He should find himself as the one who he is. And he should come to see these actors in his consciousness who distract him and make him do whatever, telling him, if you get distracted, how will you manage without us? You will fall down. You will not fall down. On the contrary, you will fly up. Until a person realizes this and starts working on himself, he will not learn the most complicated and the simplest thing: to be happy, to be alive, simply to be, and not to exist. When people study the system a little bit, meaning they really begin to engage in their spiritual development, I don't mean the modern approach to understanding of spiritual development, which is to sit in a meditation or prayer and wait for something to happen. But when a person gets up and goes, meaning he diligently starts working on himself, when he really begins to study himself as personality, to study his consciousness, that enemy inside himself who distracts him from the path to the spiritual world in every possible way. As it is said, if you haven't studied the enemy, you won't be able to defeat him.
Yes, as they wrote in ancient times, the meaning of human existence here is precisely to gain victory over oneself, to defeat the human enemy inside oneself.
This is paradoxical, but it is so. Then you become a human, and that door which we talked about opens in front of you. So when a person strives to approach this door in order to get out, he begins to observe, first of all to study, how does a thought arise and how is it controlled? And the first thing he understands is that where he invests the power of his attention, or as they say in that very Zoroastrianism, where he directs a thought or what he concentrates on, that's the state he begets in himself. And what is concentration? It's an investment of attention. We can play with words here, but the essence will not change because of that.
So, personality perceives three-dimensionality and situations in it in the way primary consciousness presents them to it. Figuratively speaking, this is when, for example, you're working in the office and your unscrupulous accountant is constantly peeking in and distracting you with his talks, but at the same time, he sneaks in some papers for you to sign. And mostly, he certainly lies about what is actually happening at the enterprise. Moreover, every time, in order to get further funding from you as much as possible, he tells you situations so that you would believe him, that it is supposedly your life, that all these are your problems, and not what he made up for his own benefit. And so, in this allegory, the unscrupulous accountant is precisely primary consciousness that surreptitiously works both for personality and for secondary consciousness, but at the same time, it always pursues solely its own material interests, while funding is exactly personality's attention.
Basically, this is true. We focus our attention on something, meaning we invest the power of our attention. We pay for this show that our consciousness is playing out for us, and actors in our head begin to stir. They start talking about this or that, but can a human call forth at least one word out of himself? No. And here again, we are faced with the fact that since a human cannot articulate a single word by himself, then who is a human? Is he consciousness? No, he is personality. So, in reality, a human is personality. Consciousness can speak, communicate. If we remove our consciousness, if we turn it off, you and I will not be able to talk verbally like this. Why? Because personality, as we already said, does not interact with the three-dimensional world, but it does interact with primary consciousness.
Yes, with primary consciousness. And in fact, primary consciousness is like a bundle of everything taken together. On the one hand, it is constantly attacked by secondary consciousness with a swarm of obsessive thoughts, various provocations for agitation of various emotional states.
Yes, and this is tracked well when you work on yourself. I can even say from personal experience that this provocative wave from secondary consciousness is barely noticeable, but it can be felt.
Yes.
And you can feel when it is slowly coming over. There arises a sort of alertness, such a subtle change of mood to something not quite good. In other words, some kind of agitation arises, sometimes with a touch of sadness, some kind of barely perceptible melancholy. It is barely noticeable, yet recognizable. You know exactly, and you already understand that the system will now start simply playing a movie for you. Then, following this provocative wave, the first impressive shot will come, meaning some kind of a clip art picture, then a voice in your head, meaning some thought comes. But without your attention, this thought is just lifeless, it is empty. And it sounds like you've suddenly recalled something, or let's think about it, just like that.
Yes, this comparisons and equalizes from consciousness.
Right, but at that moment, it is exactly you who chooses to pay attention to it or not. And depending on your choice, the situation develops further. For example, a waft familiar to you has come from secondary consciousness. Then these pictures come from primary consciousness. Then thoughts, like to be offended at something or not. And if you pay attention to this thought, that is, you begin to activate pridefulness, start to either play with this thought, or seriously consider, or savor it, meaning invest all your attention in it, then already after a short while, you just feel like you've been beaten up with sticks, because you already resent the whole world. You're also sad, all in frustration, in self-pity, in blown-up pridefulness. Thus, emotions already overwhelm you, and the system simply eats. But if consciousness offers you to be offended or not, and you choose, heck with this three-dimensionality, with all this, with the bookkeeper, and with rubices, and you simply plunge into this joy of the deepest feelings, then all situations pass as if they never happened. And you understand that those were merely provocations of the system with its illusions, and nothing more. But most importantly, you have defended your choice, defended the choice as personality, and didn't act as a slave of consciousness.
That's right.
Primary consciousness is, on the one hand, a swarm of thoughts and emotional states from secondary consciousness. And on the other hand, it is everything related to the work of primary consciousness itself, starting from pridefulness and a whole array of destructive feelings and states coming from the animal nature, such as hatred, envy, and enmity, up to its interaction through the brain with the body. It is all sorts of bodily sensations, its illnesses, emotions, everything that it hears and sees in a limited range in three-dimensionality. And so there goes such a full-scale attack on personality from the side of consciousness. Yet, as it turns out, what does, let's say, a sleeping, unawakened personality enslaved by consciousness know about three-dimensionality? Only that which primary consciousness presents to it. All this illusion of information, contrived situations, and emotional states from the animal nature. In essence, the deception by what is seen and heard. For example, it is known that 90% of information from the three-dimensional world comes through the eyes. So consciousness tells personality that supposedly you see this with your own eyes. But that's a lie, because it is consciousness perceiving through the body, through the optical system of the eyes. And what are eyes? It is sort of a little monopolist, such a monopoly supplier of visual information. So eyes are not windows to the world. They are the window leaves of the brain, which are, moreover, under control of primary consciousness. Because everything that we believe that we supposedly see is a lie. Eyes simply perceive only the visible part of the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, and only in a very small range of view. Besides, all this is transformed into electrical impulses and enters primary consciousness already through the brain. And only after that, primary consciousness gives personality a limited picture of a situation in three-dimensionality, moreover, with its corrections and set emphasis, meaning in its interpretation, highlighting some details which are crucial for consciousness itself, and omitting information that is less interesting to it.
Right. And what is less interesting to consciousness? As a rule, it is everything that doesn't give such an impressive picture for draining attention. It is everything that can free a person from consciousness slavery.
Yes, it's just a broken telephone game, when at one end one thing was said, but at the other end it comes out with such distortions that it is even difficult to understand what it was initially. In other words, primary consciousness, like a computer, almost instantaneously solves a whole series of tasks, creating an illusion as it goes and presenting it as reality, let's say the so-called reality, because even for the world of matter, for the system, reality is physics of primary energies. It is a hunt for the powers of Allat, while the rest is just illusions created by the system itself as animal traps. So it merely seems to us that we perceive the surrounding world, but in actual fact, personality does not have eyes.
Personality doesn't possess this phenomenon at all. It doesn't have that kind of eyes.
Yes, like the body has, because personality is a spirit.
Absolutely right.
Yes, personality has a completely different perception. Now you recall, how did you live previously, when consciousness was your only reality? It was actually some kind of nightmare, while you thought that life is really like this. You lived like a paralyzed invalid with one-channel TV, which created in your existence an illusion of life, but not life itself. You lived the way many people live nowadays. You lived by what this channel showed you, and it showed what it wanted. You lived in the state of illusion, of eternal melodrama, of your own short stories imposed by this channel. But later, when I started working on myself really seriously in practice, I realized that this channel turns out to be not just one, and that I have a whole remote control console in my hands. Of course, consciousness inserted its comments even here, drawing my attention as usual to empty things like, "Look how magically you are switching buttons." But when I felt this boundless freedom inside myself for the first time, the freedom of contact with the spiritual world, then I realized that I'm no longer interested in watching this TV of the system, where there are a lot of empty things, where everything is stereotypical, where bots are talking. And who would wish to listen to dead and empty stuff when real life resounds in you, when you feel its fullness, when you feel this boundless joy, when happiness is in you? When you are not a passive and depressed zombie shackled to the body of three-dimensionality, but when you are in boundless freedom, when you yourself become merged with real life, with a tremendous process of creation in love. So, perception by personality is a completely different perception. And thanks to it, you perceive by the deepest feelings this real life, this all-encompassing knowledge. And it is not limited by either time or space.
Yes.
I have also recalled an important, in my opinion, piece of information which you, Igor Mikhailovich, shared with us once, that a spiritually developed personality perceives information about the three-dimensional world not only from primary consciousness, but it is also able to perceive information from the field structures of the unified field of consciousness, sort of bypassing primary consciousness, meaning those structures from the human energy structure which are directly connected with the structures of the brain, such as the amygdaloid nucleus and others. They are described in detail in the book AllatRa under the name Lateral and Back Essences of a Person.
Yes, that's right.
So, if personality is free from the power of consciousness, it simply knows the truth holistically, no matter how this accountant, primary consciousness, would trick or deceive it.
Yes, and another interesting thing is that personality doesn't have such a function as processing of information about the three-dimensional world, which consciousness and the field structures comprised in it have. After all, personality has much greater capabilities than this entire primitive set of consciousness put together. It has a holistic perception. It makes a choice. That is, speaking the language of associations of the three-dimensional world, it decides whether to invest the power of its attention in one thing or another or not. While with three-dimensionality, personality simply has sort of, as Igor Mikhailovich once clearly explained to us, by means of associations, a two-channel connection in an online mode, on the one hand with primary consciousness, and on the other hand with the field structures of the unified field of consciousness.
Absolutely right.
And it is also interesting that even if some abnormalities have happened to neurons of the brain, for example due to development of a disease or an injury, meaning if for some reason this connection between the brain and primary consciousness is partially disrupted, for example, a person has partially lost memory or lost an ability to read or something else, this in no way prevents him as personality from developing spiritually and from continuing his existence even while being in such a body.
Yes, spiritual development of personality in practice. These are actually processes in the mode here and now. These are unique processes of contact with the spiritual world. It is creation in spiritual love. And they are associated neither with three-dimensionality nor with matter as such, because it's a different experience there. It's a different life. As for these abilities of the two-channel connection, personality has them initially. Only when it is enslaved by consciousness, they are poorly developed. Therefore, primary consciousness can constantly deceive personality with its pictures, its contrivances, fears and doubts. Even those people who practice magic up to the sixth dimension don't understand all the mechanisms and subtleties of the work of the system which controls them. It is just that at these moments, pridefulness covers the entire real situation for them. It seems to them that they are so strong, so powerful, but in reality, they don't see the main action. They simply don't see that the more they develop these magic abilities in themselves, the more their blindness to global changes in themselves increases, and the more the system trips them up and during their lifetime turns them into subpersonality, shackled by the power of their own attention to feeding the system.
Absolutely right.
Igor Mikhailovich, by the way, there is a question about spiritual vision. As a matter of fact, a person in the state of spiritual insight, of seeing some future events in three-dimensionality, doesn't see an action as such. For example, like those very mages see it, those who are limited to six-dimensionality.
That's right. A person doesn't see an action, he sees the result.
Hence, those who see the future are divided into two categories.
Yes, it's a very rare phenomenon. Those who have spiritual eyes, they see the whole picture. For them as personalities, it is hard to orient themselves where yesterday is and where tomorrow is, because for them it is always today. While those who broadcast from Ahriman, meaning from the devil, they see events. For them it happens as a déjà vu.
Right. In other words, they see events but don't understand either the essence of the process or the cause or the consequence. They merely see one puzzle piece of an event and only what the system shows to them. But they don't see the whole picture. As a result, it turns out that those who see the whole picture are right, and not the ones who dream by moments without knowing what all this will lead to. The whole consciousness is built on repeating patterns, on magic from consciousness.
Basically, this is so. The first thing people encounter when acquiring initial spiritual experience, well, you went through this and understand it. From your spiritual experience, it is precisely the handouts from the system. They distract.
Well, yes, all of a sudden, some magic abilities start opening in you on a small scale. Some supernatural situations occur on their own. And in general, some magic devilry begins to happen.
Yes, you're sitting and you know that a particular person will enter now and will say certain things. And that happens. Or suddenly, for no reason, you take a phone in your hands and a name of a person whom you haven't seen for a long time comes to your mind. You're sure that he is the one who will call right now, and at this moment there is a call. The main action takes place later, when consciousness emphasizes. It has already opened a trap and is trying to force you into a snare, parading these emotions of admiration. And actors in your head already begin to arouse your pridefulness, yelling, "Bravo! Look, how have you advanced spiritually? Now let's strengthen these abilities. Choose any object or action in three-dimensionality and invest all your attention there, in this three-dimensional image." But if you are sober of illusions of the system, if your personality is free, you understand what is happening right now. Have you spiritually advanced? No.
Absolutely right. You simply become interesting to the system, and it endows you with some of its qualities for you to get distracted and involved exactly in something that you shouldn't do, in something that doesn't generate life but destroys it. This is nothing but a lethal virus.
Yes, and we sincerely thank you for informing us in advance about these handouts from the system. So we already knew what to expect, because if it were not for this knowledge, and if we didn't work on ourselves...
Yes, indeed. Many thanks. Since childhood, the system, in fact, through some impressions obtained from movies, fairy tales, and basically from people who surround you in the world, where magic is openly hyped up, the system already prepares you that if you have any super abilities, you will be different from other people and will influence them. So again, for the system, everything boils down to the fact that you will rule and command. However, to put it more precisely, it is the system that will rule and command others through you like through a zombie. It actually throws you some magic handout like a bone to a dog. And if a person is not armed with the knowledge and understanding of what is really happening, he begins to search for this magic for the rest of his life. Moreover, his pridefulness involves other people in this process as well. The system teases a person, go and tell it to others, boast of your achievements, in three-dimensionality. At that, in your thoughts, it already shows images of those people who will admire this, even how they will do that. Those who will definitely have envy for you and a desire to learn it themselves. After all, the system won't lead a person to those who will reprove him for this action. No. Everything is planned for years in advance, and it even takes into account how you will boast to your future children, whom you don't even know about right now. Basically, infecting young generations with this virus. In other words, these handouts from the system are very well planned. The investments are small, but the profit is enormous. But when you know this, it's very easy not to succumb to such tricks of the system. Even if something extraordinary has happened, just do not invest the power of your attention in it. Understand that it's just a hello from the system.
Yes, that's an important point. Just get away from it. Do not wish. Invest attention in multiplying spiritual love in yourself, in personal growth. That's the point. And this has nothing to do with either three-dimensionality or its images, because this is something else. It's different.
Absolutely right. In other words, the system tries to distract a person who has stepped on the spiritual path with nothing other than magic. It begins to give him various abilities like extrasensory ones or something else. This doesn't happen for all people, of course, but it does for the majority. Yet many actually crave for these abilities. Let's take that very book AllatRa. Consciousness of many people became interested in it, not as an opportunity for gaining knowledge, but as an opportunity of acquiring magic abilities. What for? Again, to strengthen their power in this world. First of all, over their loved ones. People want this. And when they didn't receive it, consciousness was not satisfied, because the first thing we say is to stay away from magic. And when a person strives for magic, then, naturally, this is not what we engage in. AllatRa is not a religion, not even a set of laws or anything else. AllatRa is just a source of knowledge of where this door is located and how to get to it. No more and no less. And then the choice is up to a human. If you want to, you get up, go, open it, get inside, and learn. But all the time, you learn and do something. If you don't do, nothing will happen.
Yes, Igor Mikhailovich, you quite rightly noted that everything begins with working on oneself, with studying one's own consciousness. And when you start observing yourself in practice, you begin to understand that you didn't know yourself and didn't even suspect how fused you were with consciousness, how much everything in the system works for a result. This whole game of talking in one's head is built on control, on hidden motives in the pursuit of a prize, while for the system, the prize is the power of attention. And you just honestly keep track of the voices and arguments in your thoughts and understand that someone in your head imposes something on you, tells you something, moreover, through the prism of stereotypes. Now, I'll tell you about myself. In the beginning, when I started just honestly for myself to keep track of all this plurality of thoughts which I previously told about, in the beginning, it was even somehow a little frightening. But again, this fear came from consciousness. Moreover, this fear, this emotion was accompanied by a thought. Maybe you have schizophrenia starting. You already hear voices in your head. Well, and then it became worse. The more diligently I tracked everything that came to my mind and wrote it down, the more consciousness was frightening me with thoughts, eliminating itself, of course, as a provoker of these thoughts, meaning it broadcasted in the first person. How can I live this way? I will lose contact with this world. I will develop schizophrenia. Other people will laugh at me. So I just thought, since it is carrying me this way, it means I'm definitely on the right track, and I should figure all this out. And what defeats any fear? As you told us, Igor Mikhailovich, knowledge. I considered this a good opportunity to replenish my baggage of practical experience. I looked up medical literature, and taking into account all this unique knowledge about personality, about primary and secondary consciousnesses, the knowledge which you, Igor Mikhailovich, conveyed to us back then, and I discovered for myself a very curious point, that this tracking of a situation with the work of one's consciousness, it is not some sort of polymorphic mental disorder associated with disintegration of thinking processes and emotional reactions, what they actually call schizophrenia. And it's not even a multiple personality disorder associated with a split or with multiple selves. To this day, scientists still cannot find the cause of this phenomenon. But thanks to the knowledge that you conveyed to us, everything becomes clear and obvious. Everything that is described in medical literature is actually the problems of the body, the problems of primary consciousness. Even though they use the term personality, but again in the understanding of I from consciousness. And these problems are connected, first of all, with the fact that a person as a slave of the system is simply fused with consciousness. He is scared and believes absolutely everything that it suggests. And the first step which leads to the development of such pathological conditions as schizophrenia and similar mental disorders is excessive egocentrism, megalomania, a thirst for power, and surely a desire for something supernatural, meaning real schizophrenia from consciousness is consciousness's desire for magic.
Yes, it is interesting that, according to research, schizophrenia is a relatively rare disease, and it manifests itself for the first time between 15 and 25 years of age, meaning it's a period when secondary consciousness, with all its desires for secret magic, starts working more actively.
Absolutely right. Moreover, the symptoms of schizophrenia resemble a manifestation of a teenage crisis. By the way, there are studies where it says that not only anomalies in brain biochemistry or abnormalities in the brain anatomy are associated with an increased risk of developing schizophrenia, but also anomalies in the temporal lobes, hippocampus, and amygdala.
Yes, and there is something to think about here, especially if we compare this to the information from the book AllatRa about the phenomenon of amygdalae, which are responsible for the ability to read information, and about how all this is related to a person's physical body, to his energy structure and the work of the lateral essences.
Absolutely right. Those who have read the AllatRa book will understand a lot now. Yet I was surprised by one more point. Why do I have a fear of such thoughts? After all, before getting acquainted with medical literature, I practically knew nothing about this disease. Consciousness has already turned this word into some illusory action imagined by it. Then the real cause of this fear from consciousness has been revealed. Other people will laugh at me. And these thoughts from consciousness, what will others think about me? What will relatives, friends, family, and acquaintances consider me to be? How will I appear to them in general? These thoughts constantly arise in one's head not only on this matter, but also on other matters. That is, consciousness forces people to live more so that other people think about them, so that they consider them someone. In other words, illusorily, simply to create some contrived image in the eyes of people.
Yes, and what happens at this time to those whom this illusory image is addressed to? After all, another person's consciousness will not even think in that direction as your consciousness assumes, that you will be admired. Pridefulness begets pridefulness, and this will only beget envy and hatred of the other consciousness. It will pressure with thoughts like, that person did it intentionally and said that precisely to you in order to humiliate you and to show your worthlessness compared to him. Let me just answer him with what will surely hurt and offend him. And it will show him, will create my image, that I'm not as bad compared to him as he thinks. Well, and this game of dummy will continue infinitely in the square field of the system, until the lives of both people end. When in practice you track it in yourself and understand all this foolishness of yours, then you simply ask yourself a question. Is it worth feeding the system? Or should I actually give up my pridefulness and live inside myself by love, by the life of personality as a spirit? Because then it doesn't matter to you at all what consciousness is trying to whisper to you there in three-dimensionality.
Yes, this is interesting. When you study yourself honestly, being beyond emotions, beyond patterns and desires from consciousness, you realize that pridefulness and fear from consciousness are simply the first guard on your path to the truth.
This is the first point which causes fear in consciousness in the first place and begins to distract people. This is the first guard. But the worst thing people get hooked on is surely these abilities, magic. It distracts very much. And later on, when a person has developed a little bit, it becomes even more interesting. Here the system attempts to distract him with something and preoccupy him at every step. But all this is happening as long as a person is walking towards the door. Once he has opened the door, all these marvels and distractions disappear. The system is in fact very weak, because it has power only over a person's body and consciousness, but it can never possess that which is called personality, and all the more the soul, and it definitely cannot influence the spiritual world in any way. This is true.
Back in the day, I received very helpful understandings, thanks to your words, Igor Mikhailovich, that one should hold 70% of attention on the spiritual world and 30% on living in the material world, taking care of the body, performing some functions, tasks, and working in three-dimensionality. But at that stage, it was indeed a very important tip, because there were different states. I became involved emotionally, and then my attention already shifted to some material things.
Yes, usual, habitual things for consciousness. This is very important to consciously understand where you invest the power of your attention here and now.
Regarding redistribution of the power of attention, the power of attention is those same funds, those same resources, that same energy, whatever one might call it, but it is really significant. If a person invests this power of attention which he has, it is like vital energy, let's call it this way, or his certain resource. If he puts it mostly into that which is definitely temporary and will die, then what will happen to him?
He will die together with it.
Certainly. Whatever anyone says, it will be this way. But when a person puts the power of attention into the alive, into that which will exist forever, what will happen?
He himself becomes alive.
That's right. So where you strive and where you are going is where you will eventually come, right?
Yes, the only question is what you yourself will choose.
It is very important here that people choose. I mean, those who are craving. Again, hardly everyone needs it. In reality, I said it more than once, the personality of any person seeks the spiritual world. This is its essence. The meaning of a person's existence here is first of all to gain true spiritual freedom, that is to become a spiritual being, to gain that which every person should gain. That's why he is here. However, thanks to the existence of consciousness, there are substitutions and so on, which keep human personality enslaved. And a person simply doesn't know what he is capable of and why he is here. Let's say those very actors from the stage tell him, you as a human being are obliged to achieve this and that in the material world. It's important to form an opinion about yourself, it's important to comprehend something, and so on. Thus, they draw almost 100% of personality's attention, that is, they draw all the funding onto themselves. So a person, instead of building an eternal home, builds some temporary structures, out of what gets soaked in any rain, sand castles, as it was said in the past, which any surf would knock down and wipe it all out. But, again, it's a person's choice. A person has the right to choose, to be deluded, because that's the way it should be, it is fair. Who prevents him from listening to his inner self? No one.
He himself succumbs to consciousness's tricks.
Yes. People, even having read the AllatRa book again, having read it, but not cognized, start saying, consciousness hinders me, that hinders me, everything hinders me. But at that moment, their consciousness is speaking. I mean, they're controlled and manipulated by the system. It is enough to simply realize what is at least written in that very AllatRa book, and nothing hinders a person anymore. He will come to the spiritual world through any religion, won't he? He will. Is it complicated? No. Is it possible? Absolutely. That's the point.
Yes, if we trace in thoughts, in people's conversations, in historical literature, what in general consciousness tells people regarding spiritual knowledge when a person comes across it. It says that supposedly it's not interesting. You should correct others, but not yourself. You should fight with something and dominate, and your opinion is the only right one. But if a person still embarks on the spiritual path, it doesn't matter whether he's alone or in some religious organization. If he follows it, despite the resistance of consciousness, then it already starts telling him, you should change others because you already know everything, to the point that it says, being in service, you should kill your own kind in the name of God, enslave, conquer someone, expand your territories. But when a person works on himself in practice, he already understands that his enemy is not the people around him. The enemy is inside himself, and the enemy is his consciousness as part of the system.
The system is the system, eternal fighting and opposition. But all this is colorful, all this is illusory. All this attracts attention. It's like a flash of light in the darkness. It flashes and draws the attention of a person whether he wants it or not. But again, the darkness is not that darkness and the light is not that light.